Now, in the past, when I've given this class, I've really focused before on the zone training that I brought up earlier. And the zone training, if you were trying to get out and start a fitness program, essentially would take a periodization period. So, for example, let's say that you had some goal of climbing this big mountain 3 months from now or so. You would essentially start out building a base at the very beginning, and that base might last for 6 to 8 weeks, depending on where your fitness level would lie at that point. And when you start building that base, you would do it several times a week, but you would do it very short periods of time, 15 to 30 minutes in your training, and at a very low level. So you're down in the zone 1 level, just to start building that endurance base to prepare you to start adding more intensity and duration to your training. Then you would increase the duration and intensity only by about 10 to 15% per week, because you don't want to start trying to go out too hard, too fast, and then digging yourself into a hole. And then when you could comfortably maintain 30 minutes at that low end of zone 2, then you're starting to build what we would call a more, what's a good word for it? Before you were building up this easy endurance base, but now we're going to get into more intense endurance, more performance endurance areas. So you're going to start doing some foyers into the upper level of zone 2 and into zone 3 and even into zone 4. But they're going to be short. This might only comprise about 10% of your total training during this period. So now you're going to increase not only the intensity of your workout, but also the duration. So you're going to keep extending that duration of time that you're training to an hour or longer, at least once a week. And then allow about 3 to 4 months to build up that endurance base. I guess 3 months was probably not enough. You're probably going to be more like 5 or 6 months away from your plan if you start out in this area. Okay, you may not have to start out in that area. You may already be comfortable in this area. But once you reach that solid base, then you're ready to add speed. And so you spend the majority of your time in zone 2, but you now try to get more into the zone 4 area. If you're already comfortable pretty much with your fitness level now, then all you need to do is essentially, once you get to, if you can handle this level of training now, and you're comfortable with where you're at, then you can go into what they call a maintenance period, to where all you do is go out and play vigorously a couple of times a week. And then when you get ready to do some big climb in the future, then you can go back to this training mode and fit in here to build up to that big climb that you're ready to do. But what research is showing more and more now is that this is not the most effective way to train in terms of efficiency, in time, and in terms of really trying to optimize your performance. What research is showing more and more now is that Where you really need to be spending most of your time is in higher intensity areas, and not so much in these zone 1 and 2 areas. So I guess what I'm going to do now is diverge from what I've done in the past and go into what is being recommended now for really improved performance. If you feel like you're happy with what you're doing now, you don't have to go into this area. But if you really feel like you have room for improvement and would like to be a much better athlete, this is what science and research is showing is the best way to go. And we're talking about interval training. Why intervals? Because if we're trying to maximize our VO2 max or our lactate threshold performance, that's a very high intensity area to be in. And most of us can't maintain, none of us can maintain those areas for long periods of time. So VO2 max, for example, you're really going all out. And most athletes, really fit athletes, can't go more than 6 to 8 minutes at that level, all out. And so what you're doing with interval training essentially is going all out for short periods of time so that you trigger a response in your body to say, I've got to make an improvement here in my VO2 max, or my ability to process oxygen. And in an aerobic capacity, that's the VO2 max intervals, your durations are usually between 30 seconds and 3 minutes. One of the things that you don't want to do when you start off on an interval program, interval training program, is to go too hard. If you've not been doing intervals before, or you're not really fit and it's been a long time since you've been doing them. So that's why the range 30 seconds to 3 minutes. In aerobic capacity intervals, you should never do more than 15 minutes total in the whole exercise that you do. So it's a very quick, it can be a very quick program. So the intensity is measured for interval training by perceived exertion. In the zone trainings where they were steering you towards heart rate as a measurement, the problem with using your heart rate for aerobic capacity intervals or VO2 max intervals is that your heart rate takes some time to catch up. So that if you're doing like a 30-second all-out burst, by the time you get done with your 30 seconds, your heart rate hasn't had a chance to catch up with your output of, your breathing and everything else that's going on. And so it's actually perceived exertion that's a better measurement in this case. The perceived exertion should be, I'm going as hard as I possibly can, and when I get done with that interval, I'm gasping for breath. Okay? So an example of an interval using 30 seconds would be 10 times 30 seconds, where you would go hard, all out for that 30 seconds, turn around and go back down the hill, for example, for 30 seconds, and then turn around and do it again. 30 seconds may not be enough of recovery if you're just starting intervals. So you want to get to the point where you feel like you've recovered, because if you haven't recovered, you're really not able to go all out full board the next time. So in this case, these intervals, it's very important that you do at least recover somewhat between the intervals. Then you have lactate threshold intervals. The whole idea behind lactate threshold intervals is to push that boundary of where you transition from the aerobic to the anaerobic zone. You want to get to where you can go faster, longer, stronger before you break that zone, that breaking point. In this case, what you're trying to do is encourage your body to be able to respond to that excess hydrogen ions and get rid of them, flush them out better. So it's going to build everything in your body that's needed to help do that process. In order to stress your body to do that, you have to build up those hydrogen ions, that lactate that comes along with that. So your intervals have to be longer, but less intense, because we're trying to be right at that point where you're going from the anaerobic or the aerobic to the anaerobic zone. So your intervals should all be right about there. Your VO2 max intervals are way up there, 91 to 100% of your max heart rate, whereas the lactate threshold intervals are going to be lower in terms of your overall heart rate. The duration not only is longer, but your rest is shorter. Because the idea is that when you recover in between intervals, you don't want to flush all of that out of your system. You want to leave some of that in there so that your body is still going, ooh, I got to do something about this. So you have longer intervals with less recovery relative to the length of the interval. You can use perceived exertion on this one from 6 to 7. But the goal of this interval is to get 90 to 95%, 90 to 95% of your lactate threshold heart rate. So if you've measured your lactate threshold heart rate, then you would do this interval at the heart rate that would be 90 to 95% of that. Another way that you can measure your lactate threshold heart rate without going to a lab to have it tested is another thing you can do with a good friend that you're very competitive with, or unless you're doing a race, is to take an hour, whatever activity you want to do it at. Let's say you're doing an hour road race, okay, and you go out there and you do this run that's going to take you approximately an hour, and that whole run you race it. You race it as hard as you can race for that entire hour. And it works very well because I've done it many times. The average heart rate that you have during that race will be right about your lactate threshold, because that's essentially about the highest heart rate that you can run for that period of time without bonking because you've gone over that into that aerobic zone too long. So that's one way that you can measure it yourself. So this is one case where that would be one of the best ways that you could measure that. And then the last one is what we call aerobic threshold intervals. I was talking to somebody in here earlier about one of the training principles for endurance athletes has long been what they call long, slow distance, okay? Long, slow distance has, it does work to a certain extent. The problem with long, slow distance is that it's long. If you don't have a lot of time, it's hard to get all the benefits that you need, that you're getting out of a long, slow distance workout. I mean, this requires you to be out 4 hours and greater at least to really get any benefit. The other problem with long, slow distance is that you're always slow. So you're never really taxing some of these other, modifications that your body can make by going, into these more intense intervals. So one of the intervals now that they're going from long, slow distance to aerobic threshold intervals. These are the intervals that are going to help. One of the biggest things that these types of intervals will help you with is being able to process fat more efficiently as a fuel. it takes a long time in general to build this, but once you do, it's very important for endurance athletes that are going out for long periods of time to be able to absorb, to be able to utilize fat as a fuel. You probably have heard in marathon running, for example, people have talked about hitting the wall. Well, hitting the wall essentially is when I'm going out for an intense workout for like a 2 to 3 hour period, I deplete all of the glycogen in my muscles, all the stored glycogen that I have. And then I bonk, and that's it, I'm done. Because once you deplete all the glycogen in your muscles, it takes 20 hours to get it back. And it takes 20 hours after your muscle has healed and recovered, which usually takes about 48 hours. So it's very important that you can learn how to train your body to process fat as a fuel instead of just glycogen. And this is the interval that'll do that. Now this interval doesn't hurt as bad. This one is actually 30 beats below your lactate threshold. So that's right about in the upper level of, actually it'd be on the zone scale, it'd be somewhere in the lower to middle part of zone 2. But in this case, the interval duration is much longer, 30 minutes to 4 hours. This is a pretty easy interval to do if you're doing any mountain climbing. You can easily go out on a weekend on one of your climbs. If you're doing a 2,000 to 3,000 foot ascent, it's a very easy interval to get in this kind of level of work. So this is a recommended suggested training type routine. You'll see that, let me use the pointer, might be easier. So in the first row, we're talking about the VO2 max intervals. And they're breaking this up into what they call low dose, moderate dose, and high dose. Low dose is where you'd start if you're just starting out. It may be also an area, as I show later on, that you'll focus less on one area than another, depending on what your goals are and where you are in your training. So in this case, the low dose could be 10 by 30 second intervals with 30-second recoveries, or 7 by 1 minute with 1 minute recoveries. And then by the time you get up into high dose, then you're having longer durations but less number of reps. Then in the lactate threshold intervals, we got a similar thing here. And when I talked about lactate threshold intervals having less recovery, you can see that even though I'm doing a 5-minute interval, I'm only getting a 90-second recovery. So that's pretty fast. And then in the aerobic threshold area, you got anywhere from the 30 minutes up to 4 hours in your interval. And also, they've included the weight training in here. In this example, they're showing the more reps, but probably lighter weights in the low dose. And then as you get up into the high dose, you have more weight, but less reps. All right. So this is obviously geared towards people that are racing, but it's no different in terms of whether it's a race or an event. Okay? If you're doing a mountain climb, then the event duration is going to be greater than 4 hours more than likely, unless you're Kilian Jornet. So what you see here is essentially the ways that you would prepare for your event. Okay, the periodization that you would use to prepare for your event. So let's say your climb was the race week. Okay, that's your event. And your climb was going to be at the end of this race week period. So then you would back up here with all of these different areas of training to build up to your event. So to start, you're going to do preparation. You're going to start building that base, that endurance base. And you'll notice that we've got priorities here. So I'm in an event that's greater than 4 hours, and I'm going to start with priority being my aerobic threshold. I really want to start getting my aerobic threshold built up strongly. So that fat burning for fuel, that long distance endurance, that's what I'm going to focus on. So by it being number 1, that means you'll probably want to give it a higher dose. Okay? If you're just starting out totally from scratch, you still might want to start off easily, but you want, eventually, by the time you get to the end of this period, you probably want to be in the higher dose on your aerobic threshold. So going back on your aerobic threshold, you probably want to start, maybe if you're just starting from scratch, start off with the 30 minutes, but by the end of that period, you probably want to be up in the 2 to 4 hour range. Then your second priority is strength. So the same thing, same principle applies. In this case, you'd want strength to be your second priority, so you probably want to do moderate dose of strength. And then last is your aerobic capacity. So you'll probably want to just do low dose of your aerobic capacity at this point. Then you see that priorities change as you start building here. So you have strength being your number 1 priority here. Aerobic capacity is still third. Here, aerobic capacity moves up first, until by the time you get to your build part, then aerobic capacity is back down to third. And then this peak here is essentially a period where once you get to a point in your training program, right where you're near the event that you want to do, you don't want to work too hard. At this point, you want to maintain what you've got and keep a good edge to what you have, but you don't want to dig yourself to where you're tired. You want to be really fresh and ready to go right before your event. And a lot of people try to train too hard in this period, and that's not a good thing in terms of trying to perform at your best for the event that you've been training all this time for. So during this peak period, okay, you'll notice that all you're really doing is trying to maintain maintain your edge and lactate threshold and strength, but you're not doing any aerobic capacity, any real stressful stuff. And then during your race week, this is even less of what you're doing. You're just, again, trying to hold that edge, but nothing more. And then after the event, the rest and recovery period.
I have a question.
Uh-huh.
One of the requirements for this class is to be able to carry 40 to 50 pounds back. So where do you incorporate that into training?
That would be in all of your strength here. So you're going to be working up in the strength period to be able to carry that 40 pounds. So, for example, what you would want to do is start off here with small weights that you're wearing or carrying. And then as you work up, you're going to keep increasing the amount of weight that you're carrying until by the time you reach this race week or event week period, you're carrying your 40 pounds. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but so you start with 10 pounds, and then for how long you're going to be doing that?
A lot depends on where you start. If you can carry 10 pounds at the start with not any, I mean, it's a gradual buildup. You don't want it to start off too much and then have, you know, injuries or whatever that you have to recover from. Like my husband. He likes to start off at the beginning of the year putting 2 20-pound weights in his pack. So you want to make sure that you don't start off too much, but you want to at least start a progressive build-up so that you have time to build up in the period to your event. It's just, again, it's very similar to the retirement example I gave. You've got to back up from the event time and go, this is when I need to start making this much money, and so that I'll have this much money when I retire. I need to start carrying this much weight and continue building a plan to where you'll get to that 40 pounds without doing more than like 10% increase per week in that weight. So, for example, let's take 40 pounds at this date. Okay. I don't want to increase my weight more than 10% per week at the most, okay, without risking injury and setback. So if I'm not going to build more than 10% per week, and I've got 6 months to prepare, that gives you a long time. You could start off with 1 pound and probably reach that, 10% per week, getting to 40 pounds. But if you've only got 3 months, you'll have to work it from there as to when you start and how much.
Yeah.
Now, at the end of this, and I forgot to say this at the beginning, and I wished I'd remembered it then, this presentation has notes. All of it has notes. You don't need to be taking notes. And one of the things at the end of this that we may get to and we may not is a 6-month training plan for Denali. And it gives you how much weights and whatever, how much weight that you need to, be able to carry and how to build up to doing that is a suggested training program. So you can use that too to give you some guidelines as to how much. Okay. So, okay, so far I've told you what kind of things and what the preparation should be. This is giving you the duration building up. So let's go back real quick. So here it told you what kind of training you should be doing. This told you what priorities the training was given based on what the training periods were. This one tells you how long those training periods should be building up. So here's your race or event. And so your peak period should be 1 to 2 weeks before that event, et cetera, et cetera. So what you can do is you can say, this is the climb that I want to do. And I really need, in order to build up to this, assuming that, I'm reasonably fit, but I haven't been out doing a rigorous training plan, I'm going to need 1 to 2 weeks here. I'm going to need 6 to 9 here. Let's just be conservative. So I'm going to need 11, 17, 23, 29 weeks. Okay? In order to get to the event that I want to do. And so if I need 29 weeks, then going back to your strength question, that means that I've got 29 weeks to get to 40 pounds. So you back up and say, what do I need to start carrying there to where if I add 10% per week for 29 weeks, I get up to 40 pounds. And that gives you some idea of not starting off too heavy or too light.
Interestingly, we're about 29 weeks from Rainier.
Yep.
Timing is everything. Did not plan that.
I did not plan that, no. And that's being conservative, because you may not need all that time. If you're reasonably fit now, you may not need, 1 week preparation may be enough. 3 weeks early base may be enough. You'll have to determine that based on your personal strengths. So what kinds of aerobic exercise can you do? Not all of us can go out climbing every day. May not be realistic for one, just because we don't have time, we have busy schedules, work, etc. But also, it's really not good to do the same thing over and over and over again. I mean, it's really good to get something different, not only for, change of pace, muscle, imbalance issues, that type of thing. It's just good to have something different. Options include trail running, road running, indoor running, elliptical machines, stair stepper, power hiking, road biking, mountain biking, spinning, inline skating, my favorite cross-country track skiing, backcountry skiing, and snowshoeing. There's loads of different things you can do. I'll talk about a couple of them. Trail running, the king of aerobic exercises for climbers. I mean, that's why Kilian Jornet does it. I mean, you can't get much better aerobic conditioning than running up and down trails. Pros are it's low impact compared to road running. You connect with nature. It's kind of nice to be out there running around. Cons, you still have risk of knee and ankle injury just because you're on trail and could twist and turn and fall, etc. It doesn't work your upper body. So it's kind of nice to have sports that you can get lots of things in together. I, more than anything, love to do my strength training out on cross-country ski trails than I do in a gym, lifting weights or whatever. And some people it's not as accessible as if you don't happen to live right close to a trail or where you get off work and it's dark already or whatever. Indoor training. Only as a last resort for me. But if you have to, you have to. I mean, sometimes there's no options. I mean, because it's independent of the weather and the time of day. For most people, it's accessible. I mean, most people nowadays have access to some type of gym or equipment.
Big fan of, if you're stuck indoors, exercise bike plus Netflix. Yeah.
I've got a great exercise bike at home. We have this like the Tour de France. It's called the ProForm. Yeah, because it automatically, it has a set program that you ride, and it automatically increases and decreases the resistance depending on the hill that you're climbing. And so you have no choice but to run through it. But boring. Power hiking, and I put with poles. And the reason I put with poles is because you can get a really good upper body and core workout hiking with poles if you do it correctly. If you use the poles and push through every stroke, you can really get an all-around workout. It's more specific for mountaineering, so if you're wanting to get a more specific type of training to mountaineering, it can even be performed on level ground, but it's much more difficult to get these hard intervals, these high intense intervals on level ground. You really almost have to have a very steep hill unless you're really out of shape. Cons, almost none, other than trying to perform those high intensity workouts. If I do them with poles, I've been training with a group up in Summit County every week, where we've been going on to one of the access roads on Keystone. So it's got a pretty good pitch to it, and we have to go on that steep of a pitch to get any intensity workout in. And then my favorite, cross-country track skiing. It's the absolute top of the aerobic pyramid. It works your entire body if you do it right. The cons, it's difficult to stay aerobic. It's very anaerobic sport. Really, really difficult to go easy in this area.
Where's the closest place of a track?
Not for here. The closest would be Breckenridge. Yeah, Frisco, Breckenridge area. So that's another con. Yeah. Unless you come up to my house, we groom our own trails when we get snow. All right. Now I want to talk a little bit about altitude training. There are definitely benefits to sleeping high. And if you look at these benefits, an increase in red blood cell mass, an increase in capillary volume, an increase in the volume of your mitochondria. What does that sound like? Have we talked about this earlier?
Exercising?
Yeah, it sounds like exercising. So, I mean, you actually get benefits of aerobic performance improvements by sleeping at altitude, okay? So your body does the same thing essentially in response. It's a stress. You don't have enough oxygen. So essentially it builds the same kind of response. And so people that live for long periods of time at altitude or are born at altitude actually have enlarged hearts, have higher, volume of red blood cells, et cetera, et cetera. These are all adaptations that your body does to say, hey, I got to do something about this because I don't have enough oxygen, so I better build something to help me get more oxygen to where I need it. But by the same token, there are problems with training at altitude because you don't have as much oxygen available. Regardless of how much your body tries to acclimatize, you still can't make up for that lack of oxygen, especially when you start getting up like to my level at 9,000 feet. And what happens is when you don't have enough oxygen to go to the working muscles, you actually have a deterioration in total muscle mass and in terms of the thickness, essentially, of the muscle fibers. So you actually have a degradation of your muscular system because you're training or living or whatever at a higher altitude where there's less oxygen available. And because of that, you lose about 3 to 5% performance as a result. Now, 3 to 5% decrease in your performance may not seem like a lot, but in the Sydney Olympics, in the 10-kilometer race, it meant the difference between gold medal and 25th place. In the Tour de France, it usually means the difference between first and last. So it can make a big difference. And another interesting thing just recently that happened this year was there were two women, Jessie Diggins and Caitlin Gregg, that for the first time in history of the U.S., they won second and third at the World Championships in Sweden, the Nordic World Championships in Sweden, in a 10-kilometer skate race. This is the first time that a U.S. woman had ever had a podium finish at the U.S. at the World Championships in a distance event. Caitlin Gregg, who got third, came up to Frisco a month before the championships, and she slept at altitude, and she trained with bottled oxygen to maximize her performance while she was training. And as this is a good example of, you've always heard in mountaineering that you sleep low and climb high. In training, you sleep high and train low. Just an interesting point of view. So at very high altitudes, for every 1,000 feet that you go above 5,000 feet, you decrease your VO2 max by 3%. So that's why you have a hard time breathing when you go up there. On an Everest expedition, the average VO2 max of climbers declined from 62 at sea level to 15. Your resting requirement is 5. Doesn't leave much room without bottled oxygen. So a lot of things change. Interestingly enough, Reinhold Messner really only had a VO2 max just slightly above average. So you know how well Reinhold Messner did. So he was able to compensate for that lack of VO2 max performance through endurance. So what they've shown is that a lot of studies have been done at high altitudes and actually having people train at high altitudes, and we're talking very high altitudes. Now we're talking, up at around 20,000 feet or so. They found that the VO2 max doesn't improve at all. If anything, it declines a little. But what does improve is your endurance by as much as 40 to 60%. So you have ways of compensating even when you don't have that oxygen there available. All right, let's talk some about recovery. A lot of you have probably felt this before. When you go out and do some type of vigorous exercise, for about a couple of hours afterwards, you'll have, some soreness, to where you go to get out of the car after doing it and you're like, oh, stiffer than a board. A lot of this is just normal from edema and lactic acid buildup during your training or event that you were doing. It normally goes away if you cool down properly to help flush out all of this lactic acid, etc., edema that's built up in your muscles. Hydrate very well to allow it to do that flushing, and refuel properly. Refueling is very important. I know that Bill's going to be talking a lot about nutrition. That's something that you need to think of not only for getting ready to do your event, but also for recovering from your event to make sure that you get proper nutrition. It's very important normally after a really vigorous session of training within the first hour to take in some type of fuel to replenish what you've been using. As I said before, it takes about 20 hours to replace that glycogen that you've used in your muscles. And again, that's only after you've had recovery of the muscles, if you've actually done some damage to the muscle fibers. The second type of soreness that you'll feel is called the delayed onset muscle soreness. That one's the one that you get normally when you really stress. Let's say you do a really stressful weight workout to where you do push it to the point of almost collapsing. Then the next day or two, you'll feel that soreness in your muscles. And that's because you've actually, done some breakdown of muscle fibers. And that's the whole idea behind it. It sounds kind of, defeating of the purpose. But the idea is if you break down those muscles, then your body, if you allow it to recover, will build them stronger when it comes back. So you're like, that's normal to feel that for a couple of days. And then again, that's why they don't recommend that you do weight training or strength training more often than once every couple of days on a certain particular muscle group, because you have to wait for those muscles to recover in order to go back and stress them again. Just remember, the training works in recovery. That's when you build stronger, not when you do the actual training. Sleep tight. Sleep is so important. In the book here I've got on Fast After 50, up on the front desk, it has a whole section on recovery and a whole several sections on sleep. And all of the different hormones, including growth hormone, that are used while you sleep or being generated while you sleep in order to rebuild tissues and things that you have exercised. And a lot of times the sleep takes at least an hour and a half or so straight without being interrupted in order to generate those hormones. The older you get, the less hormones you get in general being generated, so the more sleep becomes important. So that's very, very critical to recovering. Again, you can use your resting heart rate as an indicator of your recovery, and make sure that you do recover. You asked, how do I know when I recover? It's very individual. The most important thing is if you're going out to do one of these interval sessions where you really have to get the maximum benefit, you have to be really, recovered and refreshed. Make sure that you are, that you feel like you are ready to go, ready to charge. If you start doing that interval and you're like, ugh, or your heart rate is, abnormally high or something, that you're just really not, feeling like this is really a good session, quit and wait another day to do it. Don't try to push through one of these intervals. You're not going to get any benefit out of it, and if anything, you'll just go backwards by doing that. And the best you can do is just by feel, how you feel. If things have been stressful at work or home, or you haven't been sleeping well or whatever, factor all of those things in to your recovery. And I know this is one of Greg's. Body flex. There's a lot of mixed opinions in science as to the importance of stretching or flexibility or etc. I happen to be a firm believer in it. I know Greg is a firm believer in it. If anything, I like I said before, I use my yoga partly for my strength training, but it also is really good for balance training, which is important for mountaineering because you really want to have good balance. It's really good for, as we'll talk about later, mental training, trying to focus on certain things and learning how to relax, learning how to breathe. But there's lots, like I said, there's lots of mixed opinions. I happen to feel that it really helps me a lot in keeping from injury to some extent by overstretching, trying to overreach a muscle that wasn't ready to go there. I started doing yoga when I was about 42 and I couldn't touch my toes anymore. And I said, forget it. So I started back in. Now I can put my full hands on the floor. I feel like that just by having that bigger extension and range of motion will help protect me some in overextending muscles, and as well as joints. We try to go into a deeper type of stretch. So before exercise, only do very light stretches, if at all. I recommend most of your stretching come after you're already done with your exercise and are warm. And then don't try to overstretch. Then you'll just end up causing injury. Do it gradual and hold it for a period of time before you try to go further into the stretch. And then, even the best fit people that are climbers still have a lot to benefit from learning more about their mental capabilities, their mental focus. If you look at elite climbers, they're usually people that can really hone in on their mental energy at times where they really need it, at that crux section where they really need to be able to totally shut out the whole world and focus on that one move. These are the folks that really tend to be the elite of the elite in climbers. There's nothing that focuses your mental energy than being at the sharp end of a rope. And it's that point in time where family, work, everything is gone as you focus on getting through what you need to do at that time. How do you harness that? How do you do go into that Zen period? It's all very, very individual. But what you'll find is that it's very few times that you'll have had any accidents occur when you were very focused. It's only when you tend to let your guard down and you're just la la la, when the accidents occur, and that's what you'll find in history. And so just to give you some ideas of how to work on that mental, this is a quote from a cross-country skier from this, at the time he was on a particular Saab Solomon factory team. And he's talking about in terms of racing, but it's no different than in climbing. I mean, it's in all sports, there's a period of performance where what separates the elite people from the really, really good people are the ones that are able to really focus on what they're doing and get to the finish line, so to speak. But this person says, you should never enter a race in an unready state of mind. It's like starting a race without boots. If you slide up to the line and in your head you're repeating, oh, this is miserable. What am I doing? I'm not ready. These guys look fast. Maybe I'll just ski the first half and see how I feel. Or anything along these lines, then you've knocked yourself out before the race has begun. Take a step back, breathe deep, reassess and focus, because a mind set up for failure will be ready to jump on the failure bandwagon. A mind will make your thoughts reality. Rather than have your mental state fight against you from the get-go, use the brain as a tool and set your sights high. Think about all the mental hoopla quotes you've heard over the years, from reach for the stars to 90% of this game is half mental, as said by the great Yogi Berra. These things are not coincidence. And as much as you may rue the idea of meditation or breathing rituals or whatever sports psychology means to you, the truth is these things are real. There is no right way to mentally prepare. I can't tell you how to find the right mental state for yourself. It's an individual assessment of mental strengths and beliefs. I once heard Michael Phelps say that the only thing he thinks about in a race is, I have to touch the wall first. Phil Jackson, NBA coach, believes it's best to clear the head and play in a Zen state, conscious of everything around you. The point is that there are many ways to create a successful mental aura, but it's all up to you to discover what that entails. One common denominator to all these success stories is that these people didn't just create their mental tact overnight. They developed them. Today, with the snow still a month away, mental practice may be less time-consuming and strenuous. Just find the right frame of mind. As the season nears and your big race is on the horizon, focus longer and harder. Practice day in and day out, even for a little bit at a time. Eventually, it no longer becomes a decision, but an instinct. This way, when the gun fires and people are scrambling around, flailing, hoping their energy holds, waiting for the finish to come, you'll have an advantage. You'll be ready, you'll be focused, you'll have a game plan, and this will be second nature to you. Just from personal experience, the one thing that I had to do one time in my profession, as I worked in a very stressful job, and my company essentially sent us to self-meditation counseling. And what it was essentially was you would get in a prone position, and you would think of a place that's the most relaxing place you could think of. And while you were in that, thinking of that place, they would teach you how to relax all of your body. And you kept practicing that over and over again. And in fact, the counselor that was doing it was a professional tennis player. And he used this in his tennis matches, so that when he came out and he was all nervous or whatever, he would think of that place, and he immediately, his body would just relax. So that's another, there's another way that you can think of to do some, whatever it takes to get into the zone that you need to be. And then last, in the mental area, is never climb with anybody that's fearless. They'll quickly become a statistic. Real climbers, successful climbers, they know fear. The difference is they don't let it turn into panic. They don't let it control them. They know the fear, but they know how to deal with it, and they know how to realistically assess what that fear is and continue on with what they need to do without letting it get them in a grip. What is one of the best ways that you can do that? Build a base of confidence. The more experienced you are, the more comfortable you become with whatever it is that's frightening you, then the more you can put that fear behind. So, for example, if you're afraid of heights, for example, you start getting out and practicing slowly, going up higher and higher, but at each time in a comfortable position to where you're not, just gripped with fear, and honing in on your techniques so that you know that, let's say I'm not going to fall because I'm on a rope, or my climbing skills have been improving, so I know that I'm not going to slip when I step here or grip here. So build a base of confidence to help you deal with that fear. It's also important to accept failure. If you talk to most successful climbers about their successes, they'll be quick to point out their failures as well. And because of that, what they do is they identify their failures, and they learn how to deal with that failure and improve and come back and not make that same mistake again. But if we don't acknowledge that failure and continue on without correcting it, then we could repeat the same mistake over and over again. Real quickly, I'd like to make one last quote. And this was from an article I had in Climbing Magazine, written by Arno Ilgner. He has a program called Warrior's Way. He says, recall something you did this week where you made a strenuous effort towards a defined goal. Analyze your motivation. You'll find it came from one of two places: trying to avoid something bad or moving towards something good. Take myself at the crag yesterday. Did I push through the crux because I was afraid to fall, or because I was enjoying the moves and exposure? In anything, says Ilgner, we're motivated either by fear or love. Fear of injury or falling, of failure or others' opinions. Fear has remarkable power to motivate, but it's ultimately bad energy. It frets about what we don't want to happen. Fear is about avoidance, escape, retreat, and protection, all of which may help you to survive but do not lead to accomplishment or improvement. If you're passionate about something, you do it because you love it. Maybe as beginners we started out with a healthy, wide-eyed love of climbing, but then things changed. Whereas we once climbed for pure joy, now we use it to pamper our fragile egos, or as an excuse to get away from something else like a bad relationship or meaningless job. The point is that crutches and excuses are fear-based and hold you back. Love-based motivation will boost your performance on the rock. Motivation is complex and hard to untangle. An easy way to start is to look at how you act. Love-based actions extend out into the world, looking for solutions and possibilities. Fear-based actions build walls, identifying problems and impossibilities. When fear-based, you're protective. When love-based, you're curious. Your first weapon against fear is logic. More than danger, more than difficulty, the greatest producer of fear is the unknown. Thriller movie directors know this, and so should you. Identify the sources of your fear, and you go a long way toward mastering it. Too often we want to rush through the uncomfortable parts of climbing and get to a destination where we can relax. Instead, slow down a bit and focus on what you're doing right now. Try savor it. Ilgner claims that we develop a destination mentality because we're taught to find happiness and comfort and security. Comfort, however, quickly turns to boredom. It's not a viable long-term goal. Security is equally empty. It's a state of defense, and therefore only helpful if you feel threatened. Comfort and security only exist in contrast to their opposites. True happiness must be found in growth and change. So, in conclusion, you need to establish your goals, be honest about your weaknesses and fears, build a sound plan to achieve your goal, follow the plan, and accomplish your goal. And as I said at the end of this presentation, there's a whole training suggested program for Denali, 6 months, that you can look at as well. I tried to get as much as I could in this presentation, but